On a battlefield consisting of massive capital ships with dozens of turbo lasers aimed in every direction, can a tiny starfighter even make a difference in your fleet? Or are they really only useful in the hands of the Jedi? On today's EcksToo Empire War video, we'll be looking at 5 scenarios that will show exactly how useful or useless fighters, bombers, and interceptors are in the mod Fall of the Republic. So, we spent a few hours setting up and testing the actual effectiveness of fighters, bombers, and interceptors in different fleet combat situations. For every test, I've included varying anti-fighter capabilities, as well as hard numbers for determining how effective a certain weapon type is against large targets. For our first test, we'll simply test out the maximum damage output between Vwings and Y-Wing squadrons, with no defense whatsoever. Then, progress into our next handful of tests, which show the true purpose of fighter and bomber starfighters separately. How many fighters does it take to stop a bombing run? How well do Y-Wings survive without assistance? How effective are light anti-fighters against enemies attempting to strike with bombers? All of that will be answered right now. So, our first test is just to see how strong the V-Wing and Y-Wing squadrons are against a defenseless target. I was able to do this in the fleet editor mode. You can find this on the main menu, it's very hard to miss, and the mode essentially allows you to create your own ally and enemy fleets, then pit them together to see who will come out victorious. But what many miss is that you can spawn dummy ships with all the armor and shields, but without any of the weapons. It's really neat. To start, I took 5 squads of V-Wings, each consisting of 24 fighters, and each fighter comes with a single laser cannon and concussion launcher. So in total, 120 laser cannons and 120 concussion missiles versus 1,000 capital ship health. Simple enough. Unfortunately, the results were significantly underwhelming. Over 100 fighters inflicted pretty much negligible damage to the capital ship. So, V-Wings and their weapons have proven to be insufficient for large ship engagements. But honestly, we already knew swarms of fighters aren't going to do a lot of damage against capital ships, let alone smaller cruisers. So let's replicate this experiment with Y-Wings. The total amount of weapons in a 5 squad of Y-Wings is 120 ion blasters, 120 concussion bombs, and 120 proton rockets. And just by looking at the footage, bombers are significantly more effective against a larger craft. And it's not just because they have twice as many weapon systems as the V-Wings. The proton rockets provide enormous damage to the hull, while the ion blasters help shred through the preliminary shielding. So, how can we stop a bombing run by these Y-Wings? This is where our second test comes into play. The second scenario will involve 5 ally fighters and 5 bombers. The fighters will protect the bombers from enemy interceptors, while the bombers focus on dealing capital ship damage. And here are the results. As shown, the fighters work as a decent distraction for the bombers. However, they will eventually die to the enemy interceptors. Bombers, on the other hand, thanks to the fighters, do their jobs well. But once the fighters are down, the enemy interceptors will eventually win. So, if fighters can't deal any capital ship damage like a bomber, but can't win dogfights like an interceptor, what use do they have? And are they perhaps useless? Let's move on to our next test to find out. Okay, so perhaps fighters are better at taking out anti-fighter corvettes instead. In this scenario, we place 5 fighters against a single diamond cruiser. The diamond cruiser is one of the strongest anti-fighters in the game in comparison to the CR-90 and the weaker LAC. However, just by judging from the results of this test, it doesn't matter. The V-Wings damage output is so low, it's looking like a slow loss. So let's speed this footage up. And there you have it. Okay, so it's not looking good for the fighter class at the moment. Let's try one more test. Next up, let's try something more defensive. Let's see how effective fighters are at taking out enemy bombers attempting to do a bombing run. And just looking at this, it's another loss for the fighters. Despite outnumbering the enemy 2 to 1, our fighters' intercepting power is still not able to output enough damage to kill all the bombers before they reach their target. So, after trying numerous tests, it doesn't look good for the V-Wing fighters. However, they did prove one thing. They're a great and cheap distraction. It's extremely easy to bundle a bunch of them together in one area to make any interceptor's job much harder. Whilst they won't necessarily win against the enemy, it stalls out the combat enough that bombers can execute their bombing runs and anti-fighters can take down the enemy interceptors. But we're simply not talking about buying and spawning fighters one by one in a Galactic Conquest campaign or in skirmish. We're talking about the amount that spawns from cruisers, carriers, and capital ships. Depending on your fleet format, you will be able to pull off this distraction maneuver for free, considering many reasonably priced ships with hangar bays don't really spawn many interceptors or bombers, if at all. So, despite all of the fighters' failures, it's the abundance of them for no cost that makes them fairly effective. Just don't rely on them beyond stalling for a bombing run or a retreat. So now that we have a good idea on how purposeful fighters can be, let's see how successful bombers are if fighters were completely out of the picture. Here we have 500 bombers making a run. Without any contest, the bombers will likely be able to perform their bombing run fine. And that is all the scenarios that show the strengths and weaknesses of fighters, bombers, and interceptors in Empire at War: Fall of the Republic. Now, this will likely be applicable for most other Empire War mods, but not totally accurate, so take this with a pinch of salt in other mods like Remake or Awakening of the Rebellion. But besides that, this is one of the first videos in a series we want to do that does a deep dive into the technical mechanics of Empire War. What else would you like us to cover in the future on EcksToo? Let me know in the comments down below as I read all of them, and I'll get back to some of you as well. And if you want more tactical Empire War videos like these, why not check out Eckhart's Ladder's video showing how you can win any Galactic Conquest campaign in Empire at War. I'll leave that video in the info card appearing in the top right now or on the end screen of this video. But besides that, guys, I've been Charlie, you've been watching EcksToo, and I'll see you in the next video. Take care, guys.